Hello, I'm Bill Serban, Director of the Center for Advancing Teaching and Learning at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. This presentation examines research findings on the effectiveness of different learning techniques. The aim is to identify techniques that can improve student learning and others that may have little or no effect in helping students learn. By the time students reach college, we expect them to be able to regulate their own learning. One of the most basic aspects of self-regulated learning is using specific learning techniques to acquire, understand, and remember new material. For example, one student studies for a test by reading the assigned material and then rereading it. Another reads the material and underlines or highlights portions of the text. And another studies by reading the material and creating a concept map. Students may use a variety of learning techniques. This table shows the types of strategies used by 177 undergraduates at a highly selective university. As you can see, students also have preferences for specific techniques. In this case, they clearly prefer rereading notes or the textbook as their #1 strategy. These are all commonly used learning techniques by college students, but we have to wonder whether some are better than others. Which ones are likely to be most effective? Are some ineffective? If we know which learning strategies are most effective, can we teach or persuade students to use them? There are hundreds of studies on learning techniques, but few attempts to determine the relative effectiveness of various strategies. Individual studies usually compare several techniques, such as whether rereading results in better learning than note-taking. However, in 2013, a group of researchers examined the research on 10 common learning techniques and developed a procedure for ranking their relative utility. Before looking at their rankings, let's first look at how they decided on the utility of a technique. They examined the techniques with respect to 4 critical variables. First, they looked at learning conditions, whether students worked alone or with others, read or listened to material, had access to resources while they learned or not, and whether the study was embedded in an actual class or conducted as a lab experiment. A second criterion were student characteristics. They looked at differences in students' age, ability level, motivation, background knowledge, and the like. A third criterion was the type of material students tried to learn. Was it lecture content or simple vocabulary, narrative versus expository text, visual material, etc. And last, they looked at how learning was measured. Were students required to recall the information they learned, write an essay, or take a recognition task, such as a multiple choice test? Based on an extensive review of the research, they assigned an overall assessment to each technique based on its relative utility, low, moderate, or high. A high utility rating means that compared to the other techniques, there's robust evidence across the 4 criteria. In other words, a high utility technique improves learning for a variety of students in a variety of circumstances with respect to different subject matter and materials as measured in a variety of ways. A technique received a low utility rating for a number of reasons. There may be insufficient or inconclusive evidence about whether it improves student learning, or limited evidence about the conditions, students, or types of materials for which it works. Note that only 2 techniques, practice testing and distributed practice, received a high utility rating, while 5 techniques were rated low, including highlighting and rereading, which are very popular strategies among students. You may want to pause the video on this table to review the descriptions and ratings of each technique. To explore some of the key principles related to learning techniques, let's compare 2 techniques, rereading and practice testing. Rereading is widely used by students. In the study reported previously, 84% of students used rereading, and 55% indicated that it was their #1 strategy. You can understand why rereading may appeal to students. It is relatively easy to use and involves repetition, which is consistent with the belief that repetition is essential for learning. And for unskilled learners, it may be the only strategy they know. In contrast, practice testing is not widely used. Only 11% of students reported using this technique, and only 2 out of 177 said self-testing was their number one strategy. In addition, research also indicates that students view practice testing as ineffective compared to other techniques. Why is it less popular than rereading? Practice testing may be perceived as inherently more effortful than rereading. Trying to remember something you read is more difficult than rereading the material. Another possible factor is that during retrieval practice, students may conclude that they aren't learning much or getting much out of the experience, especially if they have difficulty recalling the material. Students may conclude from first-hand experience that practice testing is not effective. Let's turn to a comparison of how and how well these techniques work. Rereading does have a positive effect on student learning, but one that is limited compared to other techniques. One early study depicted in this graph found that the greatest improvement from rereading came between the initial reading of the material and the first rereading. But there was no improvement from the second to the fourth rereading. It appears that more rereading does not improve learning. According to researchers, rereading may work because students can add new information to the representation of the material each time they pass through it. And students may also identify main ideas and reorganize the material, resulting in a more coherent knowledge structure. If rereading has a positive effect initially, then why does it turn out to be a weak learning technique? I suggest that rereading may be less effective because of the way that students reread the material. To be most effective, rereading depends on careful consideration of the meaning of text. Students must monitor their understanding and recognize, with each pass through the material, what they know and don't know. Unless students allocate more attention to unlearned material, they run the risk of learning nothing new with each rereading. Moreover, as the text begins to look more familiar, students may assume they know it. Instead of processing it deeply, they may do the opposite, assuming because it is familiar that they already know the material. Informal reports from students indicate that they may do this quite frequently. Now let's look at practice testing. Studies of practice testing generally consist of a learning phase in which students read the new material, followed by a retrieval phase in which they try to recall what they studied. Practice testing is also referred to as retrieval practice. It involves self-testing in which students try to retrieve or remember what they learned previously. Many who are unfamiliar with retrieval practice assume that students are given tests that they study. That is not the case. Nor does it involve being repeatedly tested in high-stakes graded circumstances. Retrieval practice is quite effective. This graph depicts typical results. College students who use practice testing consistently outperform those who use rereading. This particular study showed that students not only remembered more factual information, but they better understood concepts and were better able to answer inference-based transfer questions. Why does practice testing work so well? Practice testing may seem counterintuitive. Why would trying to remember what you studied previously result in better learning than actually spending time restudying and relearning the material? At this point, there is not a definitive answer to this question, but most explanations focus on what may take place as students are trying to remember during the actual retrieval process. As students try to remember the material, they make additional connections between the concepts, and these can become retrieval cues for future recall. In essence, the student's representation of the material becomes more enriched, and there are more ways for students to retrieve the information when needed. Let me add 2 other ideas about why retrieval practice may be effective. Research shows that practice testing is more effective when students receive feedback. We can speculate that feedback might be especially salient after self-testing because students have actively worked through the topic. They may be primed to see the relevance and make better use of the feedback. A second idea is that over and above the direct effects of retrieval practice, self-testing may enhance learning because it helps students identify what they do not yet know very well. In this case, it serves a metacognitive function. Students are able to identify gaps in their knowledge through self-testing and then go back to relearn the material that is not well understood. The current research helps to identify strategies to enhance student learning and calls into question some popular techniques that are of limited value. In future presentations, I will address how teachers can promote skilled use of effective techniques among their students, and how we can design our classes and assignments to ensure that students use more effective ways to learn the subject matter.